Today we are talking more about the square root property. So you should be on page 7 of your notebook. And remember the square root property from yesterday. If we have an equation with x squared and we have to take the square root, then we will end up with two answers. We're going to end up with a positive and we're going to end up with a negative. So let's solve some more problems using this property. Let's look at x squared equals 49 first. What do you think our first step in this equation would be? To solve for x, the first thing that we need to do is take the square root. When we take the square root, we'll end up with x on one side. Our square root property tells us that we are going to have plus or minus the square root of 49. And finally, we need to look at the number and figure out if we can simplify it. Can we take the square root of 49? Yes, we can. So in this case, we can simplify that radical. So we will have x equals plus or minus 7. So our answers are positive 7 and negative 7. Let's look at another problem. We have 2x squared equals 4. In this case, our first step would not be to take the square root. What do you think it would be? It would be dividing by 2. When we divide by 2, we'll end up with x squared on one side, and then 4 divided by 2 is 2. Now it's time to take the square root. When we take the square root, we'll end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of 2. And you're done with that problem. That's your final answer. Our next problem says y equals y minus 3 squared equals 5. What do you think our first step is here? Our first step is to take the square root because right now we can't add that 3 because it's stuck inside the parentheses of that squared. So we need to take the square root. When we take the square root, we're going to take what's on the inside here. So we're going to have y minus 3 equals, when we take the square root of 5, make sure that you have that plus and minus. It's very important. Now we look at y. What else needs to move to the other side? That minus 3 needs to move over. So since it's minus 3, we need to add. When we add, notice that we have the square root of 5 and a whole 3. We cannot combine these two numbers. So we will end up with y equals plus and minus the square root of 5 plus 3. And that's it. You don't need to do anything else. That's your final answer. Let's look at another one. Here we have x squared equals negative 4. Now usually we would take the square root here. But if you look over here, we have negative 4. This is a negative number. Since it's negative and we do not work with imaginary numbers in this section, all you need to say is no real solutions and you're finished. You are not solving that problem for the imaginary solutions. Now let's look at the last two. We have x plus 2 squared equals 25. Our first step here is to square root. Once we square root, what will we have on the left side? We'll have x plus 2 because the square root and the squared will cancel out and we take what's in the middle. Equals, we can take the square root of 25, so we will have a positive 5 and a negative 5. Now you can leave that plus and minus 5 in there. And when we subtract the 2 to the other side, we would get x equals plus and minus 5 plus 2, that should be a minus 2. So when we are looking at this problem, we can't really know what to do if we have plus and minus 5 minus 2. So what we need to do is break this down into two separate problems. And there's that plus again, so let's change that to minus, because that's what it should have been. And then we will get x equals positive 5 minus 2, and x equals negative 5 minus 2. And when we get our answers, we will get x equals 5 minus 2 is 3, and x equals negative 5 minus 2 be a negative 7. And those are our two answers, positive 3 and negative 7. Now let's do one more together. Over here we have 3x minus 17 all squared equals 28. So if we look at this side, we need to take the square root first. Once we take the square root, we'll have 3x minus 17 equals, we can't take the square root of 28, so we have plus and minus 28. Although we can't take the square root of 28, we can simplify this. What are two factors of 28? 4 times 7 is 28. Can we take the square root of 4? Yes, we can. So we're going to take the square root of both, and this will simplify. So the square root of 4 is 2. Since we can't take the square root of 7, we will leave it underneath the radical. So this will give us 3x minus 17 equals, we'll still have that plus and minus, but instead of square root of 28, we're going to write 2 square roots of 7. Now there's a couple more steps and then we'll be done. First, to get this x alone, we need to add that 17. So we'll get 3x equals plus or minus 2 square roots of 7. We already have that. And we added the 17, so we're just going to add the 17 on there at the end. We're trying to get x alone, so when we look back at x, the only thing left is that 3. Right now it's multiplied, so we need to do the opposite and divide. Once we divide, we'll have x alone, and we write everything else. Plus or minus 2 square roots of 7 plus 17 all over 3. It can't be simplified, so just leave it as it is. You don't need to do any more work. I know that looks a little bit confusing, but that's your answer and you're finished.